From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report. In some ways, the high school girls at the Pretoria Hospital School seem like many other girls their age. But there is a major difference. Most of them will become mothers by the end of this year. South African researchers say about 30% of girls in the country become pregnant by the time they are 19 years old. Only 1/3 of these girls stay in school while they are pregnant or after their babies are born. The Pretoria Hospital School is the only school in South Africa with a special separate program for pregnant girls. 100 pregnant girls are currently taking classes there. Most were forced to leave traditional schools. Sometimes South African schools expel pregnant girls, although the action violates the law. Many pregnant teenagers never finish their secondary education. More than 30% of high school students never graduate because of pregnancy. Dorothy was one student who came close to being in that group. She was expelled from school when she got pregnant. She spent months at home searching for another that would accept her. She arrived at Pretoria Hospital School earlier this year. She says she feels welcome and supported. Rina van Niekerk is the leader of the school. She says the most important goal is to bring the students up to the right educational level and keep them on that path. She also says there are some attendance problems because of pregnancy-related sicknesses. Pretoria Hospital School opened the program for pregnant teenagers in the mid-1980s. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Agriculture Report. Climate researchers met recently in Cameroon to talk about threats to Africa's land and animals. They said they believe the continent may lose as much as 30% of its animal and plant species by the end of this century. They blame the losses on the warming of the earth, population growth, and unrestricted development. The researchers represent 20 African, American, and European universities. They say countries south of the Sahara Desert are losing forest faster than any place on Earth. Wood companies are cutting down trees to meet growing demand from China, Europe, and the United States. The population is growing 3% each year. There are now homes, factories, and farms on land that once was forest. Many African animals and plants no longer have a place to live as a result. Climate change also continues to threaten species. Thomas Smith is with the University of California. He says Africa may lose 40% of its mammal species because of expected rises in temperatures. The African chimpanzee is among the mammals at risk. Mary Catherine Gonder is a professor at Drexel University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She studies chimpanzees in the Congo Basin. She says their forest home is disappearing. She also says hunters continue to kill the animals to sell as food. The researchers say it is important to develop environmentally friendly economies. The Congo Basin area of Western and Central Africa has the second largest equatorial rainforest in the world. It is important to the lives of millions of people. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman. From VOA Learning English, this is the Health Report. Clinical depression is a serious medical condition. The word clinical is added to identify people who are depressed from those who simply feel sad because of life events. People with clinical depression can experience extreme sadness, hopelessness, and a sense of worthlessness. Often, they are unable to carry out the usual activities of life. Sometimes they commit suicide. Clinical depression can be a difficult disorder for medical professionals to identify and treat. A treatment may work for some patients with depression and not others. Helen Mayberg is a researcher at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. She says the first treatment for depression often fails. So, doctors must try different methods of treatments until they find one that is effective. But technology may change that. Ms. Mayberg leads a team of researchers at Emory University. They used brain imaging technology called PET, or positron emission tomography, to study treatment effects. The study involved 63 depressed patients. They received either medication or talk therapy. The researchers found that one area of the brain, called the anterior insula, seemed to predict which treatment would work. Patients with a slow-working anterior insula did best with talk therapy. Patients with a very busy anterior insula reacted well to the antidepressant drug Lexapro. Ms. Mayberg says the anterior insula may be a biological marker for depression. She says her team's findings could help doctors treat mental disorders like other medical conditions. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report. A neighborhood school in New York City produces champions at the game of chess. Students at Brooklyn's Intermediate School 318 have won 32 titles or championships in competitive play of the ancient game. The preteens and young teens have even defeated older students. John Galvin is an assistant leader and the chess program chief at the school. He says most of the young people come from homes where conditions make it hard to succeed. poverty is a major difficulty many students face. Mr. Galvin says the program teaches the children that they can be great at something. 80 students are members of the chess team during the school year. Chess Summer School is open to 40 young people. They learn skills like planning and decision-making. Student Samantha Dong says, the game calls for imagination. Another student says, chess helps with all kinds of schoolwork. And the students say, chess is fun. The school program has gained worldwide fame. In 2012, Norwegian chess grandmaster Magnus Carlsen visited the school to congratulate the national champions. A film released at that time tells the story of 5 team members. The movie, Brooklyn Castle, also shows the difficulties they face in their personal lives. But the school's leader, Eric Windley, says the value of chess is that it gives every student a chance. Anyone can play the game, he says. 98% of intermediate school 318 students graduate from high school. Most go on to attend a college or university. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carla Babb.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. Investors in the United States are preparing for the first public sale of stock in the Chinese company Alibaba. The company sells goods by linking buyers and sellers in the huge Chinese online market. Alibaba is expected to make its initial public offering, called an IPO, in September on the New York Stock Exchange. The total value of the company, based in Hangzhou, has been estimated at about $200 billion. Reports from Bloomberg News say Alibaba is offering investors a 12% share of the company. That would mean the company could raise more than $20 billion in the public stock sale. After the IPO, Alibaba could become one of the most valuable technology companies in the world. The e-commerce company is responsible for most online sales in China. It dealt with more exchanges last year than U.S. companies Amazon and eBay combined. And it has more than 230 million active buyers. Scott Kennedy is director of Indiana University's Research Center for Chinese Politics and Business. He says Alibaba has grown from a very small company 15 years ago to the main online seller in China. The company holds about 80% of the Chinese online sales market. Scott Kennedy says the company is profitable, which is unusual for a technology company first offering an IPO. Alibaba has chosen to sell its stock to the public on the New York Stock Exchange rather than in China. China is now the world's second largest market for e-commerce. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Presutti.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Technology Report. The war in the Gaza Strip is being fought as much on the internet as it is on the ground. Some people say the increased use of social media is changing the way people look at the conflict. Palestinian activists recently put a video on the YouTube website. The video shows rescue workers trying to help a Palestinian boy look for his family. Suddenly, the boy is seen lying on the ground. The video claims he was shot by Israeli gunmen. A second bullet appears to kill him. The video was shared on social media. Palestinians and Israelis have fought before, but now Palestinians are telling their war stories directly to the world through social media. Lisa Goldman is with the New America Foundation, a nonprofit group. She says Israelis have used Twitter for a long time. She says Palestinians on Twitter is a much more recent event. Youssef Munir heads the Jerusalem Fund, a pro-Palestinian group. He says that earlier news reports about the Middle East were generally pro-Israel. But he says active social media work by Palestinians is changing how traditional media report the news. The Israeli government understands the power of this new technology. Jed Shine is the social media director at Israel's embassy in Washington. He warns against thinking that social media truly show how the public feels about issues. There is little scientific evidence to prove how effective social media is in reporting about the conflict between Israel and Gaza. Lisa Goldman says it is important to have news media professionals report from conflict areas. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Agriculture Report. The World Food Program says the increasing number of conflicts in the first half of this year has created a huge demand for food aid. The WFP says it has had to use airplanes to transport 50 times more food this year than in the first half of last year. The planes drop food into areas that are difficult to reach by land. The group's air service is called UNHAS, the UN Humanitarian Air Service. UNHAS planes carry food to people who cannot be reached by roads or rivers. UNHAS has transported about 7,600 tons of food so far this year. The planes have also flown more than 1,000 tons of supplies and equipment to 21 countries for the WFP and other aid organizations. More than 90% of the supplies went to just 3 countries: the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Syria. Conflicts in those countries have displaced millions of people. Cesar Arroyo is the WFP's flight chief. He says more than 3 million people in South Sudan alone are in need of food. He says about half of them cannot be reached easily and need help immediately. Mr. Arroyo also says it is about 6 to 8 times more costly to transport food and other supplies by air than by road. He says it costs $1 billion a year to use emergency transport planes to carry food and other supplies to areas of South Sudan. The WFP official says the situation in northern Iraq is becoming more difficult. The Sunni Islamist militant offensive has displaced many people. Hundreds of thousands of people fled to Erbil in Kurdistan from Mosul when the militants seized that city in June. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Presutti.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. International economists say they are hopeful about Africa's economy. They say economic growth on the continent will increase by as much as 5 or 6% over the next 2 years. That would be the continent's highest growth rate since the worldwide economic recession in 2009. Economic experts say the growth is partly because governments have established policies inviting to foreign investors. They say increased trade among African nations is also growing the continent's economy. And the experts say the growth is widespread. They made the observations in the African Economic Outlook 2014 report. The African Development Bank, the United Nations Development Program, and the OECD Development Center produced the report together. Angela Lusigi is a UN Development Program economist and policy advisor for Africa. She says, many people think the growth in Africa is driven by mineral wealth only. But, she says, African countries that are not rich with resources also show economic growth. The report says Africa's top foreign trade partner is Europe. About 40% of African trade is with European nations. The report says African countries traded $81 billion worth of goods among themselves in 2012. The report says East and West Africa are leading the economic expansion. The report says low inflation, especially in energy and food prices, is helping economic growth in Africa. And it says African nations have established policies to cut spending and improve tax collection. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carla Babb.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. Last week, we reported that international economists released a hopeful report about Africa's economy. The African Development Bank, the United Nations Development Program, and the OECD Development Center wrote the report. It predicts economic growth on the continent could reach 5 or 6% over the next 2 years. Economists expect 7% growth in West Africa's economy in the next 2 years. They say oil continues to be a major source of income, but that other industries are also important. Growth in Nigeria is coming from agriculture, trade and information, and communications technology. Manufacturing is helping Ghana grow. Sierra Leone is the fastest growing country in the area because of its iron ore exports, as well as its agriculture and building industries. In southern Africa, Angola, Mozambique, and Zambia are expected to grow between 5 and 7%. Labor problems and weak foreign export markets have affected growth in South Africa. But that country is still expected to grow almost 3% over the next 2 years. Angela Lusigi is an economist and policy advisor for the Regional Bureau for Africa in the UN Development Program. She says many countries are working to balance their budgets, and they have solid financial policies. She says the next question is how to make those improved policies result in growth that helps all of a country's citizens. She says inequality remains a big problem in Africa. Ms. Lusigi says it is important to have growth that affects all people and not just one group. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Technology Report. European airplane maker Airbus plans to have new passenger airplanes by the end of the year. The new models will use some of the most modern technologies, including metal parts made in a 3D printer. The high price of airline travel is largely the result of fuel costs. So, airplane manufacturers want to build lighter planes with more fuel-efficient engines. They also want their planes to have more seats. Modern airplanes, like the large Boeing 787 Dreamliner, are made from a mixture of plastic and carbon materials. The current Airbus A350 plane uses plastic parts created in a 3D printer. But the model A350 XWB plane will be the first with parts printed in the hard metal titanium. Peter Sander of Airbus says company technicians learn to print very complex shapes. 3D printing also helps when parts are no longer available. Mr. Sander says Airbus engineers recently needed an extra part for airplane seats that was no longer made. He says it was fast and easy to redesign the parts and to print perfect copies. He said the process took 1 week. The technology is developing quickly. Axel Krein is Vice President of Research and Technology at Airbus. He says the number of printed airplane parts will continue to increase. He says Airbus is investing a lot of money in aerodynamic improvements, in materials, and in noise reduction. But he says 3D printing is probably the area with the greatest gain. The U.S. company General Electric says it is investing $50 million in a new 3D printing factory. The factory will print fuel system parts for airplane engines. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report. The school year has begun in Cameroon, but thousands of students and teachers are fleeing their schools in towns that border Nigeria's Borno state. The state is the home of the Boko Haram terrorist group. 1,000 children were expected to start classes in government schools in the border town of Kolofata, but only a few arrived. Fansha Renee was one of those who did come to school. The 17-year-old said Boko Haram attacks in the area have frightened away students. Recent fighting between the Nigerian Boko Haram rebels and Cameroon soldiers damaged the school. Pamela Singeth works at the government school in Kolofata, but she fled to safety at a military camp. She said she could not advise any child to go to school in the border area because it is dangerous. She said Boko Haram had destroyed classrooms. Like Kolofata, the town of Mora also borders Borno State. 700 students were expected at school in Mora, but only 100 appeared. Instead, the students found more than 2,000 Nigerian refugees in their school building. Babila Akau serves as an administrative official for the area. He said he asked the Ministry of Education to postpone the start of the school year. Kolofata and Mora are just 2 of the 25 schools near the border with Nigeria's Borno state. Monuna Fatso is Cameroon's Secretary of State of the Ministry of Secondary Education. He says the government plans to move students from local schools for security reasons. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.